fake news? Is it a new digital pandemic? Many people say that information is the most powerful weapon on earth. Information will continue spreading as long as there are people on this planet. Unfortunately, some top managers underestimate this threat because they forget that it doesn't cost cyber criminals that much to launch what is called an information attack and spread fake news. But the reality is that an operation like that can deal ridiculous damage to businesses. Does this mean that when we become even more dependent on digital channels, fake news will be one of the main threats to humanity? Ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure to introduce two legends of journalism who will shed light on this interesting topic. Mr. Vladimir Pozner, journalist and broadcaster, and Mr. Nick Gowing, BBC World News main presenter, founder and director at Thinking the Unthinkable. Vladimir, Nick, thank you very much for joining Cyber Polygon. It's a pleasure to have you. I will let you do what you do best. Gentlemen, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Nick, how are you?
Good to see you, Vladimir. And I should underline, if I may, that I'm not at the BBC anymore, so I've distanced myself in the last 6 years, so don't think I'm speaking for the BBC.
Well, I'm not speaking for anybody but myself. I want to make that very clear. This fake news thing, I have this question, it seems to be a simple question. Do you and I agree with the title of this dialogue, and can fake news become a new digital pandemic? How do you feel about that?
Well, two things, Vladimir. First of all, there is a digital pandemic, but let's set that to one side. Fake news is a terrible problem. It's rhetoric versus reality. I think the rhetoric of something called fake news is deeply destructive. I think it should be dispensed with. But since one senior political leader in the world decided to label anything he doesn't like as fake news, it's become fashionable to say anything you don't like is fake, even if factually it is correct. I think it's a terrible, terrible description. It is not correct. There is stuff which is not right, but it doesn't mean to say fake. But when a president of the United States keeps telling journalists, you're from the fake news media, that is deeply destructive. Yet on the other side, Vladimir, there is a very serious problem of a digital pandemic of information which cannot easily be verified.
You know, we were talking, I heard the gentleman saying that information is a powerful weapon. It always has been that. If you go back to ancient times, information was limited to a very small group of people who actually ran their country. It could be priests, it could be kings and aristocrats, and average people or ordinary people did not have access to information. And gradually that's changed. What with the appearance of newspapers and then the appearance of radio and the appearance of television, and now, of course, the appearance of the internet. But the question I often ask myself is, do people really get information? It seems to me that even when the information is true, it's very superficial. There's no depth to it. It's just a question of almost just like a headline. You don't go any deeper than that. So do people, in your opinion, actually, how should I say this? They have access to information, but do they take advantage of that access in this day and age? Or is it just, it's become the short 3 words, 2 minutes, and that's it. No, the attention span seems to have gone way down. People no longer write the way they used to. I mean, I've read letters from, say, John Adams to Thomas Jefferson, incredible letters, but they're 8-10 pages long. That doesn't happen anymore. So, you know, fake news, I agree with you that you've got to be careful how you use that. But if people aren't really interested in depth in information, then I think that's even more dangerous.
I think the trouble with the term fake news is it's the kind of thing in rhetoric that anyone of any stature who doesn't like something and says that is fake news, don't give me that. I think that's deeply, deeply destructive to discourse. And of course, it's become politicized. But I'm quoting here from the latest Reuters Institute for Journalism report on digital journalism, which was published less than a month ago, saying that global concerns about misinformation remain high. I think there's a problem. If you get rid of the label of fake news, there certainly is a problem of the pandemic that we're here to talk about, Vladimir, which is those who are out there, whether states, whether corporates, whether others with vested interest, are determined through trolls and everything else, and also just bad discipline, to get flawed information out there in order to twist minds, to persuade people. And you and I are journalists. My job, certainly as a journalist at the BBC and at ITN previously, was to make sure that what I said was as correct as we could make it in the timescale available. And I think this is putting enormous pressure on those who just consume this stuff off a screen to actually ask questions. Is that really true? Does it match my logic? I think the problem in all of this is the following: that too much of what is out there, and what is the pandemic, if you like, suits the views of those who are reading it, and therefore they don't question it. Therefore it proliferates, and it does become fake, but it is not the fake news that certainly one leading politician of the world has made you want to believe.
You know, many, many years ago, when I was living in the Soviet Union, and I began to look for a job in the area of journalism. And I have to make a qualification here. There was no journalism in the Soviet Union. You know, journalists were called soldiers of the ideological front. And a soldier gets his orders and he does whatever he's supposed to do. And if he does it well, he gets a medal. And he may go up in rank and ultimately become a general, but he's still a soldier. But nonetheless, there existed newspapers, and I was invited to join an organization called Novosti Press.
I remember it, Vladimir.
Yes, and I found myself in a department where I was editing articles that had been written by other people. And I later found out that those articles were disinformation. In other words, they were articles that had been written in Russia, and then they were sent off to other countries, mainly third world countries, and published in the local press and signed by local journalists who hadn't even written them. And this was totally
challenging question it all.
This is disinformation, just in pure, you know, that was it. And when I learned that, I left that department very quickly. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the attempt to sway people's views, to impact public opinion by political organizations or politicians, by organizations, by companies and corporations. There's nothing new about that, really. It's been going on for a long time. Sometimes it's very vicious, sometimes less so. The difference, though, is that today with the internet, you can reach many more people simultaneously, I suspect. And the ability to, I don't know what word to use, but to poison people's minds has become much greater. I mean, I think the views that we have of each other, the views that people in the United States have about Russia and the Russians, or vice versa, the view that Russians have about Americans. You know, where do they get these views ultimately? This is where they get them. And very often those views have very little to do with reality.
But there is a difference between misinformation and disinformation.
Yes.
There are plenty out there who want to disinform for political reasons, for corporate reasons, corporate social responsibility, and so on. I would say there's more chance than ever now that governments and also corporates, NGOs, and those who knowingly deceive in this new environment will be caught out, because there is a fantastic positive in all of this. The blowback, whether it be on Twitter, whether it be on Weibo, whether it be on WhatsApp, whether it be on any of these platforms, there is now ability, not just of journalists but others, to bite back, to say that is not true. What you're saying is incorrect, and it's a deception. Now, obviously, those who say that can also be deceiving themselves. So there's disinformation, which is knowingly put out there, but there's misinformation, which can often be a proliferation of something which is not correct. 11 years ago, for the Reuters Institute, when I was still at the BBC, I wrote a paper about Skyfall of Lies and Black Swans, about how those at the top believed that they could ultimately control everything. And I wrote about the new vulnerability of power, politics and systems to the new digital space. And most in positions of power and responsibility said, no, no, we will always control power. We will always control information on our terms. They did not want to even believe there would be a problem. Of course, there is now. And this is now really challenging, I would suggest to you, governments and also corporates, that eventually there are those out there, we're seeing it in the United Kingdom with COVID-19 and what is being said about what the government claim they're doing and what is being seen on the ground. There is an incredible kind of democratic rebirth. But the public out there largely do want good information. And I think the challenge in what we're talking about here, Vladimir, is the ability of those who want good information to look at something on a screen, look at it, something on their laptop, look at something on their iPad or whatever, and say, I'm not sure that's right, because I know enough about that. And am I being conned? Am I being misled? Or is it just shoddy writing?
Well, you see, you're making a very important point. You're departing, that is to say, you're launching your argument based on a sense that your average viewer, listener, reader has a critical outlook. From the outset,
yeah.
He is or she is thinking, well, now, is this actually true or not? I think that there are an awful lot of people who don't have that critical outlook.
I agree.
And who just swallow it whole. Now, if you just have someone who comes up to you, and this may have happened to you, it's happened to me many times, and says, look, how do I know that this information is true? What am I supposed to do to really find the answer to that? And the only thing I can say is, well, probably you have to compare. I mean, here's a story, for instance, that the Russian intelligence has paid Taliban's money so that they kill American soldiers. Okay, now that news has come out. It was in the New York Times and the Washington Post. How do you make a decision that yes, that's true? Because it turns out the general such and such said, well, we have no proof of this. And someone else said in America, well, this is kind of, a queer kind of look. How is a person supposed to get to the bottom of something? I mean, have you got a recipe?
My instinct when I heard that story, for example, is it's plausible. It's plausible in this dirty business, which is now going on around much of the world, that right. Kind of thing could happen. But look, people sitting like I'm sitting, where I'm sitting, like you're sitting, where you're sitting in your home. You can't easily go out there. You've got to be motivated to find out. And in the time available, you tend to consume whatever is put on the screen.
Right.
You have to have that questioning instinct. And I'm quoting here from the Reuters Institute for Journalism. As the news media to changing styles of political communication, most people, 52%, would prefer the media to prominently report full statements. And I think what is interesting, which is emerging since I've left broadcasting essentially, but the NBC, for example, the new global NBC channel based in America, but based also out of the UK, it hasn't been launched yet, are saying that they want to now forensically show where they're getting their information from and the judgments they're making in a newsroom as to why they're saying what they're saying. That is an incredible level of accountability, because certainly traditional media that you and I've worked for, certainly that I've worked for, there's an assumption that if I'm saying something as a presenter or a reporter, it has been fact-checked, it has been checked to the most extreme levels possible within the deadlines we've got, but ultimately there could be a degree of vulnerability. What's happening around that corner? What's happening around that corner? We could be not as complete as we're giving the impression. Now, certainly, that imperfection in news coverage is being seen as something which can be sold as a brand advantage, because actually news cannot be 100%, but it is not the same as how do you deal with fake news. good journalism and good news platforms are about challenging, whether it be the ITN, whether it be BBC, whether it be well-known brands, or many of the other fantastic brands which have developed in the last few years. And they have made their names by challenging basic assumptions and orthodoxy on information. And that is a profoundly valuable thing to be doing in this fake news era. But as you and I know, it takes money, it takes resources. And what we've seen with BuzzFeed recently, for example, is that they've had to sack a lot of people or let a lot of people go simply because the revenues are not there to fund this kind of journalism.
That's right. And there's another issue, I think, and this I say this with hesitation, but I think it's absolutely true, that a lot depends on the education of the person we're speaking about.
Yep.
If someone is well educated, has a university education, has read, has traveled, that person's reaction to what he or she is reading or listening to is one thing. If you're talking about someone who finished grammar school or the like and has not had the opportunity because of where that person comes from, has not read very much, his knowledge is limited, that person is much easier to fool and much more ready to accept whatever he or she is told. So I think that who does, when we're dealing with this, you don't want to call it fake news, deliberate attempt, a deliberate lie, that's what it is. Who is it directed at mainly? In my opinion, it's mainly directed towards the ordinary person, not towards the intellectual elite, not towards those who have the ability to actually think it through, but to those who've not had that advantage, to the less privileged people who are the majority and who are the ones who vote and who are the ones who ultimately, when they say the people, they are the people. And I think that they're the ones who are victimized by this trend.
But we are talking about the US president here, who has, if you like, created the popularity for fake news simply because in the White House briefing room, he will actually dislike and despise a journalist for say, you are from the fake news media. I'm not going to answer that. You know what I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
That has become a culture, which is a really dangerous culture. But I think the important thing to take away from this, Vladimir, is the following, that there are the traditional main journalistic organs like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, even though it's funded by Jeff Bezos, and also CNN, who have made a point of actually challenging all of this. And as a result, they've created a significant increase in viewership and audience and readership. Now, it's still a minority, but it shows that there is a demand and a consumption need for good audited, good moderated information, and stuff which is rubbish is actually highlighted as rubbish, whether it be on the website or whether it be in hard print, which people are still reading.
How do you feel about people who write on different platforms of the internet, bloggers, tweets, Facebook? I mean, do you seriously consider that to be journalism?
Not journalism as such, but we're talking about fake news and good facts in a digital space. And I'm quoting again from the Reuters Institute here, because I think given what Facebook has been facing in the last few weeks about the pressure on it and the withdrawal of advertisers, big advertisers like Unilever from Facebook, because they weren't prepared to be more discriminating about what they post, including whatever the US president says. But the Reuters Institute for Journalism says Facebook is seen as the main channel for spreading false information almost everywhere. But WhatsApp is seen as more responsible in parts of the global south, such as Brazil and Malaysia. Now, why do I say that? It's emblematic, I think, of the root of your question, which is that there are, because it appears one by one in 2 dimensions here on our screen, and I've got a screen in front of me, you assume that it must be good information if it's clearly written in decent language, and appears to be factually based.
Yes.
But the trouble is the platform itself is allowing that stuff to get out without it being checked.
That's right.
That's something which I think now people like Facebook are on the run on this. And I think there will be a backlash, not least because the advertisers, as they did 2 years ago with Oxford Analytica, are running away saying, we're not going to be part of something which is promoting fake information.
How do you feel about the famous words attributed to Abraham Lincoln? We have no real proof that he ever said that, but nonetheless, it's attributed that you can fool some of the people most of the time, and you can fool most of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. Do you think that applies to fake news?
Most certainly, yes. I think in the end, and that's what's beginning to come through in all the data, particularly because of COVID-19, people want good information. And look at the difficulty that Bolsonaro, who now has been tested positive in Brazil, the difficulty he is facing because of the way he's handled information. And it's beginning to show in the polling in the United States. Here we are 3 months before the presidential election, and also, of course, the congressional elections, that this is now having a backlash. So I would suggest to you that even if in a country like the United States, there's a core of 20 to 30% who back Trump, and I'm using this emblematically because it's easy to talk about the United States as opposed to some other countries, even some in Europe like Hungary and Poland, because what you're seeing is the public is beginning to react against this stuff, which is not credible, not believable, and which they know to be incorrect. And therefore, I think what Lincoln said, and of course he didn't have even the advantage of more than a horse for that message to be transmitted, I assume. He didn't have even a telex machine, or he didn't have a handset. It had to be communicated. We have to assume he said it. And maybe it's got varied and modified in the telling, as good stories do, as you know, Vladimir, as we all know. But what Lincoln says is, I think, beginning to become a serious issue. And that's why when we're asked to talk about a new digital pandemic, there are those out there who want to seize the high ground in this sky full of lies, as I wrote about 11 years ago. But there are others who are saying that's not the way down which we want to go. It'll affect us commercially. It'll affect our brand. It'll affect our reputation. And therefore, we do not want to engage in that because these kind of things are more important. That brings us back to COVID-19, because even politicians who've been less accurate with the truth are now being seen to be on the back foot, because things which they said and which they said optimistically are no longer seen to be correct. And that, particularly in a democracy, is going to be very difficult for them to defend, because I think what you're about to see is voters and electors who have long memories on this and won't let those politicians get away with it simply because of the personal trauma they've been through, including loss of friends, loss of their family members, and also loss of jobs, loss of economic potential, economic opportunity. And you've seen what the European Union has just announced, that the rate of deceleration of GDP is going down 1% more than they predicted, almost 9% rather than 8%. Yes. These are frightening times, and therefore fake news and the digital pandemic has a real role in this, which you and I can speculate about here in the middle of the week, in the middle of July. But actually, we're not sure which way the dynamics are going to go yet.
No, we're not. If you were given the green light and the power, how would you combat fake news? What would you do about it? I mean, are we talking about the need for some kind of censorship? Do we have to, how do we control this? Because, as you said, it is very dangerous. It affects people's minds. It affects business. And when business is affected, that affects the way we live. It's insidious, and it's impossible to immediately understand that it is wrong. So, you know, if you were given a wand or something and said, okay, go ahead, fix it, what would you do? What would be your recommendation?
Well, I don't think I'm in a position to even make a recommendation, but what you're seeing is dynamics which are changing. The trouble is, Vladimir, the speed at which the digital reality is changing is far faster than any regulations can ever be constructed, whether it be in Parliament or by presidential decree, simply because the reality of what you're seeing of digital change is extraordinary. But I remember at a conference in Helsinki a year ago, and he gave a speech also in Berlin at the same time during his visit to Europe. Sir Nick Clegg, who left as former Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and is now a very senior acolyte of Facebook, made clear very publicly that Facebook wanted regulation. I also heard Eric Schmidt of Google say the same thing as well, that regulation would be the way forward. But I don't think regulation can catch up with the new reality, because at the same time, Facebook and Google and so on are making enormous amounts of money by exploiting this ambiguity. So yes, there is an ideal way forward, but it all boils down to money. And that's why I quoted to you the kind of things that I've certainly enjoyed in my newsrooms under a regulatory body where we have to do things in a certain way in the United Kingdom, but it's happening across Europe as well. And you're beginning to see it in other countries as well, where there's an acceptance that certain things have to be done in a certain way, certainly with the legitimate journalism. But then when you look at Jeff Bezos and the fact that he contributed 250 million, only 1% of his wealth, to saving the Washington Post, and the self-confidence that that money has given the newsroom when it was under pressure financially, and what you can see from the success of the New York Times and other newspapers as well when the news business is suffering, and the success of the Financial Times, which is a global newspaper, of course, where they now have more digital subscribers than they do subscribers of the pink hard copy. These are big changes where regulation probably will have a role eventually, but the reality is moving far faster in sinister ways than actually regulators can begin to catch up with it, even if the politicians say that's what we should be doing.
Well, if that's true, and I think it is, then the future looks somewhat somber to me.
It does, I think.
Huh?
I think it does.
Yes.
You know, we are in an existential crisis here, which it's not a nuclear war, but certainly in all our work at Thinking the Unthinkable, we were warning about this, thinking the unthinkable. The unthinkable is happening with a massive implosion, a deceleration of the global economy, which is going to affect everyone's, quite apart from the medical challenges, which is going to affect everyone's pocket. Most people, this is not unthinkable, it's actually unpalatable, because we knew a pandemic was coming, but no one really at the highest levels wanted to grip that problem. It could have been tomorrow, it could have been next year. But the reason I say that, Vladimir, is the following, that the public is scared at the moment. The public is looking for somewhere where it can have trust, and it needs to have trust in government and governance. And the corporate sector in many ways has been far more rewarding and far more positive towards the anxieties of the public, who may not have a job next week, may not have income. Look at in India, look at in many countries where people survive on the basis of the cash they get every day in their pocket. They may not even have that money for buying food. These are profound societal challenges. There's an earthquake going on at a speed which no one could ever expect, as you'll have heard in the corporate sector, including in the digital sector, that 5 years of changes are happening in 5 months, 5 weeks, even 5 days. I can tell you, we were saying that as part of our Thinking the Unthinkable work a few months before all this happened, and people thought we were smoking something. But the new reality is profound because of the vulnerability of the public, apart from those who've been lucky enough to make a bit of money in this crisis, whichever country you're in, whether you're in the emerging country or you're in one of the G7 countries. Look at the difficulties Saudi Arabia is having at the moment with the oil price. I know there's a dialogue here with Russia on this, but there is. A country which is massively wealthy has been essentially neutralized. Its mobility has been neutralized simply because people in Saudi Arabia didn't expect that a country like theirs could be immobilized by something which is an epidemiological and a virus threat, a zoonotic threat.
Well, when you talk about security, this is a very serious issue.
I agree.
Organizations introduce different kinds of measures to protect their organizations, their companies, what have you. How do you protect the average citizen who is the target of not only disinformation and not only misinformation, but deliberately wrong information, which we could call fake news? How do you protect? Can a government, can a society, in your opinion, find ways to protect the citizen from this pandemic? What do you do? Or do you simply say, well, you're going to suffer, but in the long run, you will learn how to stand up to this?
I think they can't be protected. I think NATO was set up to protect the alliance of post-war World War II. One of the main threats has been a nuclear attack. What we're experiencing at the moment is an equivalent to wartime without a war, but the war is an epidemiological war. I don't think people really understand the scale of adversity, and that's why I'm making the comparison to a kind of a nuclear attack of that kind, which would kill a large number of people. What we're seeing now is a level of adversity which people are going to have to confront, where essentially their lives are going to go backwards, both in terms of wealth and opportunity. And it's going to be particularly difficult now for the next generation. And the next generation are therefore picking up their smartphones, picking up their pads and thinking, I want to find a job, I want to find a new opportunity, where can I do that? And that's where good information, and that's why you and I and those of our profession need to have heart, that there will be those who are looking all the time for good information. I feel quite pessimistic, though, on the societal front, and that's where good information, not fake news. Fake news is a sinister and destructive distraction, I think, in this environment, which we have to think about as we're talking about it today, Vladimir. But the other half of the question we've been asked to talk about, a digital pandemic, not of fake news, but of information which is out there, which is misinformation and disinformation. And governments are now being caught short if they do produce disinformation. They're being held to account, as corporates are as well. And I think corporates are well ahead of governments on this.
Somehow I don't share the feeling that governments are being held accountable.
No, I don't either.
I think that they're actually not answering for anything in the sense of the kind of myths and disinformation that they spread through different sources. I'd like
Can I just clarify what I meant? I actually agree with you. The public, though, is in a position through its understanding through the digital environment of how they can challenge governments. But I agree with you. I slightly contradicted myself in my response to you.
Right. Well, I don't really have much more to say about this. I think that but you and I have painted a rather grim picture of the future. We have not provided any kind of real answer as to how you deal with this kind of information, which is not information, which affects the way you think, which in turn affects what you do and what you say. I've seen a lot of this in my time, and I'm seeing more and more of it. Rare cases when a journalist is held accountable. You probably remember a few years ago, I forget the man's name, but he was on NBC's Nightly News, and he told a story about flying in a chopper and participating in some kind of battle, which he did not. And so he was basically fired, and he held a very, very important job. But that was just one very separate case of a well-known journalist having crossed a red line, which is not permissible. But what we see on the internet is countless people doing this, and none of them are answer for it at all. There's nothing you can do about it.
Everyone can do this now. Everyone can do this. You and I used to rely on something simple and straightforward, a platform, but everyone can do this now. And the challenge for all of us is to be discriminating and say, I don't believe that.
Aha, exactly. Well, I wonder if our moderator wants to ask any questions, because frankly, I feel that we've pretty much covered the ground that we were asked to cover. Unless you feel that there's more to say about this.
I think we're out of time, actually, looking at the clock.
Oh, are we? I didn't know that.
You and I, as broadcasters, we look at the clock all the time, Vladimir. Come out on time every time.
Television. Hey, television. Every minute. One thing I do want to ask you, Why, or I should put it differently, but why has television in so many ways come down to sound bites? You're invited to come on a show, you're given 3 minutes, and you have to tell the story of the world. You cannot remotely get into a subject that is terribly important, but you have to say it in 3 minutes. That's not fake news, but it's castration, if you will, of news.
No, but I think good people, good politicians and good corporates, anyone can actually summarize something in 3 minutes, but that's not to in any way cheapen what they're saying. But remember, there are other things out there now, like transcripts. There are other things out there like podcasts. There are other ways of hearing much more about somebody, which is the basis of that sound, that clip. And so there's a layering going on, which means, okay, you can be taken in by 15 seconds or 30 seconds, but actually often now there's much more out there. And that's what's good about so many broadcasters and so many news platforms now. There's a layering of information, which means you can see much more of the context in which that was said.
Gentlemen, I hate to interrupt such an interesting conversation, but unfortunately, we're almost out of time here. But thank you very much for this talk, and thank you for supporting Cyber Polygon and joining us.
Nice to meet you, Vladimir.
Talk to you, Nick.
Thank you.